right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Tim Moen Show. This is my first live broadcast. I'm testing out the technology. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but if you have any questions during this show, please drop them in the comment box. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Rumble, we're simulcasting 3 different places. At least I hope that's what's happening. And if you're on any of those platforms, you can feel free to drop your comments. Let me know you're here. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you have anything positive to say about your day. It's my wife's birthday today, so that was fantastic. We celebrated her birthday, had a nice time. I talked about all the lessons we've learned over the past year. What have we learned? You know, theory, we're aging. We should be getting wiser as we age. It took me a little while to think of something I learned over the last year. I feel like I'm getting dumber as I get older, but I feel like I'm losing. I'm doing the opposite of learning, but no, I came up with a few things. For example, one of the things I came up with was I really learned the value of fraternity, of brotherhood this year. I started a men's group, and that men's group has led to this podcast. It's led to a bunch of positive things in my life. And, you take guys for granted. You just kind of assume a person's a person. I've got my wife. She's my best friend. I confide in her everything, but there's something to be said about having a band of brothers, having that masculine point of view. So that's something I learned this past year for sure. And it's been a positive to me. All right. We are going to be talking about chaining government down today. The thumbnail I used, if you noticed, was of Odysseus. You remember from Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus was traveling. He was told by the gods to stay away from the island or the rocks where there were sirens there. There's beautiful women with their attractive call. It was irresistible to people. It was irresistible temptation. And they would lure you in with all these promises of, we just want you to bask in our beauty and we just want to shower you with love. But of course, what they really wanted was you to die. And so Odysseus's big plan was, I'm going to see these sirens, but I'm going to get you sailors to put wax in your ears so you can't hear anything. And me, I want to hear their song. So I need you to chain me to the mast so that I can't do anything and I can't be tempted by their siren song. So that's exactly what they did, and it worked. And this is a perfect analogy of what we want to do with government, because you step into that role of government. You're the leader of whether it's a prime minister or president, leader of your nation, the head of state. You have all these siren calls out there calling to you, asking you to, promising you all your greatest desires will come true if you follow me. And even if you go in there with good intentions and you want to say, cure poverty, clean up drug addiction, fix crime, have all these grand ideas, you're lured in to the rocks by these sirens who end up being your demise. And that's what happens with government all the time. And so one of the ways we chain government down, one of the ways we lash it to that mast is with a constitution, a solid constitution as well. Canada's constitution has been pretty piss poor. And especially the last 3 years have demonstrated that in spades. My guest today, Brenton Froehlich, will tell you that it's been more like 3 decades. I might argue it's actually been maybe closer to 100 to 150 years. We can talk about that a little bit more. But welcome my guest, Brenton Froehlich. Brenton, thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Tim. I appreciate it a lot.
Now, Brenton, before we get into your efforts to chain the government down, to try to relook at the Constitution and start the discussion, at least, I want to know more about you. Where do you live? What's your background? How did you get involved in this project?
Well, I live in Peachland. I was actually born in Alberta in 1965. My parents sold the farm in Trochu and moved to Kelowna when I was a year old. And so I've lived in the Okanagan almost my entire life. And most of those years have been right here in Peachland, which is A heck of a nice place to live.
It is a heck of a nice place to live. Brenton, I actually worked down in that area for a summer. I was Fred Flintstone for a summer down there. I worked for Fred Flintstone. I worked for Little Caesars, and I did a construction job. I held down 3 jobs. My girlfriend lived down there at the time. And yeah, loved it. It's God's country down there. It's beautiful. Everyone wants to move there.
Yeah, so I grew up in Peachland. I've mostly been involved in various business ventures over my life. I've worked at different jobs as well, but I've worked in pretty much every resource industry except commercial fishing, and even spent some time in the oil patch up in Fort Mac, like many people in Western Canada. Just I've had a varied background. I've always been a very curious person. I didn't go to university and get a degree or anything, but I've been an armchair academic over a number of subject areas, whether it's geology or forestry or business in general, economics, politics, of course. I grew up in a very political household. My grandfather on my mom's side was a member of Parliament. Was elected 6 times to the House of Commons, representing the Caribou riding of British Columbia.
That's a pretty conservative riding, I'm guessing.
Very conservative. It was rural. It was back in the 50s and 60s. He was part of the social credit movement of Western Canada. And, so he was very involved in politics. And in fact, my copy of the Canadian Constitution and selected statutes is his copy, which I treasure with fondness. But I grew up in a household that was politically aware. Politics was talked about, like, I think, every day at the table.
Is that right?
For one reason or another.
Yeah. And, did you guys have a lot of debates, or was it mostly kind of agreeing with each other?
I think just as a kid, I remember just listening and absorbing, right? I remember going with my dad, just even as a little kid, to the coronation of Wacky Bennett when he got elected during one of his terms as Premier of British Columbia. I remember being there with my dad when I was small. But as I got older, of course, there was a lot of political debate. And, you tend to, pick up a lot from what your parents are putting down. But as you get older, you're like, yeah, you know what? I think I'm going to cut the cloth a little bit different. But definitely I grew up in a household that valued hard work and family. And, that I grew up with a worldview that government was not there to take care of me. That I never had a viewpoint that I ever have looked to government for anything in my life. Right. That's not the viewpoint that I've had. It's been a very conservative viewpoint from that perspective.
And would you say your I guess your perspective or your views on politics or government and its role in society has changed at all since you were a kid, kind of listening in on those conversations, kind of going along with the culture in your household? I mean, that's kind of what mine was, right? It was like I just kind of went along with what my dad was saying. It made sense to me. And later on in life, I kind of did a bit more reading and kind of formed my own views. But how is your, I guess I'm looking for your political evolution, or where you were to where you're at, kind of thing. And what led you there?
I grew up at a time in history where when you went to school, you sang "O Canada" every morning. Right. You said the Lord's Prayer. You had a Bible reading, and then you went to school. And the picture of the Queen was front and center in the classroom. And so I grew up with a worldview that the monarchy was very important to Canada, and from being educated just in the public school system, I got a pretty good understanding of how the parliamentary system governed Canada, and that and I grew up with the belief that generally speaking, government was there to represent the good interests of the people of Canada. Now, when I was a teenager, there was a real movement to create the Republic of Western Canada back in the 80s. I still have a baseball cap that has that on it.
Wow.
So there was quite a push for that. And of course, my dad, he was...
And what was
You
the
know,
push for it at the time, Brent? Was it the National Energy Program?
it was
Trudeau was,
it was the National Energy Program, yeah. And so, you know, being in a household that was quite adamantly against that kind of interference by the federal government, it was like, okay, well, that could be kind of interesting, but as a young man, you don't really know what that looks like.
right.
I became quite enamored by the Reform Party and the movement with Preston Manning.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, this is a patriot. He's our man, and a triple elected Senate, and the West wants in, and all of those great catchy buzzwords. And as election after election happened, I became more and more disillusioned with the fact that something's wrong with the system. Like, the election's over by the time we even get to go to the polls,
Right.
and and just began to have a growing frustration with left versus right, because I could see corruptness on both sides of that aisle, and you watch people get into power, and it's like, well, you're really not doing a whole lot different than the other guy, except you might say that you're not going to take our guns away as quickly as the other guy. But I became quite disillusioned with that, and I started to dive into probably 15 years ago. I started to really look at political systems and constitutions around the world. Obviously in America, different state constitutions. Europe, Switzerland was very fascinating. How they've kind of created an interesting government system in Switzerland, and so I started thinking about a lot of the super big picture things, like how to solve a problem that no one else thinks can be solved.
Right.
And I kind of enjoy spending time thinking about that. And I'm an avid reader. I love history. So I specifically have read a lot of people that you would consider to be from the Enlightenment period,
Right.
in the 15 and 1600s. Rousseau and Hooker and John Locke and Burke and different people like that have contributed a tremendous amount to political philosophy. And in fact, if you look behind the curtain of the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, you'll find all of those people that wrote extensively on political theory and economics and human rights, natural human rights, back in the 1500s and the 1600s. So guys like Thomas Jefferson and Adams and Madison, they were original thinkers in many great extents. However, they were building very heavily upon the men that had gone before them in developing those ideas. So that's kind of been my journey. I've become a lot more libertarian, I think, than I was when I was younger.
Right.
And I mean, for an example, when I was a teenager, it was like, drug dealers, shoot them all.
Yeah.
And because I kind of got that from
but not the pharmacists, though. Not
he
those
was
drug
pretty,
dealers.
yeah,
Right?
exactly. He was pretty cut and dried.
Yeah.
But now I'm like, you know what? If someone wants to, do drugs, I don't condone it. I would never do it. But if someone wants to partake, is it really any different than alcohol?
Yeah. Wow.
And so if I think that to dictate whether or not someone can do something like that in their life I've come to believe that it's really a violation of their right to choose as a human being. And it's not all choices are good, but if we're going to dictate people's right to choose, that creates a slippery slope, and we've seen where that takes us.
Well, people have to be free to choose heaven or hell, right? I mean, that's kind of free will, and it's like, You take that responsibility. As long as you're willing to bear the consequences, as long as I don't have to bear the consequences of your actions, who am I to stop? In fact, what right do I have? In fact, maybe it's even more deviant. Maybe what's even more deviant than snorting fentanyl is me trying to control what you put into your body. That might be the real deviant behavior there. Okay, so you've done a lot of reading, and you kind of formed your own political perspective. What brought you to your current project? Maybe describe your current project and why you started it.
Well, when the Freedom Convoy started to roll across the country, and I've shared this on a number of podcasts, I was never more proud to be a Canadian. Never. I had tears in my eyes watching those trucks roll across the country, and thousands of people lined up along the highway. I know that my wife and we participated in a number of convoys that went down to the Canada-U.S. border here in the Okanagan, and we protested at the border on a number of occasions, and it was an amazing experience just to see people come together. And it gave us a sense of hope coming out of a very, very dark time. And I think history can argue what that is compared to, but I think it certainly has been one of the darker chapters in Canadian history.
Definitely.
Certainly, I believe the darkest chapter in terms of affecting the most amount of people.
Right.
And I'm not going to minimize the darkness of, the oppression that's happened because of the Indian Act.
Yeah.
The internment of Ukrainians in the First World War and Japanese Canadians in the Second World War. Those were horrible, and we can talk about all of them further because they do need more recognition. But from a pan-Canadian perspective, nothing has impacted the number of Canadians in the way that the last 3 years did. So for me, and I believe that for a lot of people, what was happening in Ottawa just gave people this tremendous amount of hope. It's just like, oh my gosh, like, is this like the equivalent of the Green Spring and the Arab Spring or whatever,
right?
Where we're going to see just radical political change in Canada. So I don't think anyone really knew what was going to happen with that, but it gave us hope, and hope is a very powerful thing, just like fear is very powerful. And when the Freedom Convoy got jackbooted on the 14th of February by Justin Trudeau, I was, like a lot of Canadians, I was very angry. And I just started to write. I enjoy writing. I write mostly just for myself, just so that I can articulate thoughts and develop things. So I started to write, and I just started kind of pouring my thoughts and feelings out on paper. And what came out was a lot of stuff that was in the background. It was from years of political thought, right, and philosophical thought in terms of the whole idea of natural rights and inalienable rights. A lot of thought and perspective on the very foundations. John Locke would refer to it as the beginning and end of civil government. Like, where does government come from? Like, how does government even begin? Right. And what are those roots and seeds? And so I was pretty angry, and I started to write, and I love the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I've read it many times. I think that other than the Bible, it's one of the most amazing documents that have ever been written, especially if you can realize and understand all of the history behind it, the backstory that caused that document to appear. I love the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And so I'd been reading it again after the Freedom Convoy was crushed, and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to start to write. And I loved the format that Jefferson had used in the Declaration. And I just started to kind of go, you know what? I just want to do the same thing. I want to build a reasoned case against our prime minister and our government. and a reason for making commitments that are at the end of that declaration, the 7 declarative statements. I wanted to provide a case that was logical and coherent. I wanted to articulate an indictment against the government, and I wanted to frame some things that I believe to be true, and then summarize that with the declaration itself at the very, very end. And so it took me about 13 months of revisions. I mean, most people have read version 59.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and it was, it was about 3,500 words at version 56 or something like that. And I had met a fella by the name of Dr. Salim Mansour. You may know of him, and
Yeah.
many of your audience may be familiar with him. He's an amazing man, very, very articulate and knowledgeable. Speaks the truth, I believe, in everything that I've heard him talk about. And I had met him briefly at an event in Kelowna in the spring of 2022, and had just a super short conversation with him. But I told my wife, Jalinda, I said, I need to talk to this guy. I'm not ready yet, but I need to talk to him. I need to share with him at some point what I'm working on, because he just seemed to be a fit for what I was doing. So I reached out to him in February of this year, and I sent him my manuscript, and I just basically said, hey, what do you think? And he got back to me immediately, and he said, hey, this thing is amazing, and it's timely. And so he worked with me and gave me some edit suggestions. He said to me, he said, Brent, he said, right now you have a chapter, but he said, I want you to make this Canada's version of the Gettysburg Address. And you need to trim it down. And so I had it down to 1,000 words, and then I brought it back up to about 1,300, and that's what we ended up publishing, which is what you see, which is around 1,300 words.
Right. Okay. And so your hope with this is to kind of inspire a conversation, or like I've noticed at least 1 or 2 political parties have picked this up as kind of a project that they want to advance. What is the kind of hope with this document now?
Yeah, great question. So on a personal level, I want people to read the document, and if it resonates to them, and for most Canadians that have had any sort of a negative experience in the last 3 years, it does resonate to them. The feedback that we've had has been just nothing short of amazing, from the comments that people have had. But I want them to realize that, number one, on a personal level, that we've been lied to as Canadians. I refer to it as the great charade. And we've been lied to in terms of our rights and freedoms in Canada. We've been told that, we have rights and freedoms, but we actually don't, because Parliament is supreme. And the last 3 years have shown us that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that articulate and supposedly recognize our rights, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Interestingly enough, our Constitution does not pay any recognition whatsoever to natural rights and the idea of inalienable rights that are not endowed by government.
Yeah. Well, that might get in the way of governing or something like that, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I want people to understand that they've been lied to, because the Charter is a charade. It's not real. I want people to realize that Parliament is supreme, and in all aspects of Canadian life. And a recent example of that is, prior to the internet, and a lot of your viewers are not really, they weren't even around before the internet, right? So prior to the internet, the government, the Parliament, through the CRTC and various other pieces of legislation, they controlled the media in Canada. They controlled Canadian content on radio, on television. They decided what cable news networks you were going to watch. They were very involved in print media and what was available in Canada in terms of like magazines and newspapers and all that kind of stuff. It was very heavily controlled by government. The internet turned that tap wide open,
Right.
and it took control away from government and put it in the hands of individual Canadians who could watch whatever they wanted and get news wherever they wanted to and access whatever information they wanted to or to create. And so the exertion of Bill C-11, which just was passed by the Senate yesterday, I believe, which is the online censorship bill, it is simply, and it is censorship, but it is in a real sense, Parliament reasserting its authority over Canadians and flexing its muscle. And we're going back 25 years to before the internet,
right,
where the government is now again in control.
Yeah, this is Bill C-11, right, Brent?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bill C-11. Yeah. So we want real people to realize that Parliament is supreme, but that we as Canadians have inalienable rights. And when you go through the whereas section, it talks about that.
Right.
That and you know, it's an interesting thing to talk about, but it's one that I don't believe requires a lot of intellectual bouncy castles to come to the conclusion.
Right.
I don't think that there's a person on earth anywhere who does not believe that they have the right to life. And it doesn't matter if you live in North Korea or China or Miami. Everyone has this inherent belief that, yeah, you know what, I have a right to life. Because otherwise, why would they be offended if someone, took their life away?
Right.
And why would they be offended if someone took the life of their loved one?
Yeah.
Right. So there's this, and I had a chat with some folks recently that were from Hong Kong, and I asked them this question: where do you think you have the right to life? And they said, yeah. I said, where'd that come from? And they indicated to me that it's just something that you know. And even though they grew up in Hong Kong, mostly under British rule, but they left there after the Chinese government took over. And so everyone understands this. So if you have the right to life, and if you do want to do a lot of thinking about it, virtually every other right that you think you might have in your life emanates from that human right.
Sure. Well, how would you respond to what Knuckles 2761 has to say here? I don't like natural rights idea. It leads to classic argument. Life is a natural right. Therefore, doctors can't decline service. So I think he's saying here that it's kind of saying that you have a positive obligation then to keep me alive or support my life if I have a right to life. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think you need to take the doctor out of the equation, first of all, because whether we have medicine or not, I mean, think back to, let's just think if we rolled the clock back 2,000 years and we didn't have doctors, right? I guess the question I would have for that person is, does he not believe that he has the right to life? So if he doesn't believe that he has the right to life, which, there maybe he's one person on earth that doesn't believe that he has that right. And if he doesn't believe that he has that right, then he should be completely happy if someone takes his life from him.
Yeah. Or relatively indifferent
or indifferent, or he shouldn't complain about it.
Yeah. I mean, there has been this kind of, I guess, twisting or corruption of the idea of rights, right? Like that rights can be understood in two different senses. There's positive rights, which are, if you have the right to healthcare, that means that I, as a paramedic, am obligated to provide you with healthcare. I'm obligated to, use my body and my resources and my time to provide you with service, no matter what. And that's obviously an incomprehensible right to have. I can't possibly do that for everyone. I can only do it for one person, and I can only do it when I've had enough sleep. And I kind of like to have a paycheck. So when I've had a paycheck and different things like that, that's a positive obligation. But usually when we talk about rights in terms of constitutions, or, when we talk about liberty or libertarianism, what we're talking about is negative rights. In other words, thou shalt not infringe, thou shalt not, right? They're shall nots. In other words, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. My right to swing my fist stops short of your nose. That sort of thing. So when we say we have a right to life, what we're essentially saying is you don't have the right to take my life, nor do you, nor does anyone else. The only person that might have the right to take my life is me. But
that is correct.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, there's a lot of, I don't know if you've ever read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but it's an interesting document, but I think it's abysmally written.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of positive assumptions in there, right?
I guess I kind of break rights down into, either a natural right that is universal to every human being.
Right.
If a right is not universal to every human being, I would not consider it to be a natural right. But they have in there, they have a million things that well, that's an exaggeration, but and I want to be truthful, so it's not a million things, but they have things in there that I would consider to be not natural rights, but legal rights, right? Or, like there's a difference between, a group of people coming together in community and making a decision that, okay, so as a community, this is something that we are going to recognize universally for a common decision. And that may be, we're gonna create a healthcare system, and we're going to make it accessible to everybody.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a universal human right that is a natural right, but it's a decision that we've made as a community to create a benefit that people can access under certain conditions or whatever. So I think there's a big discussion on both sides of that. But going back to my,
but from my perspective, that requires a positive obligation from people, right? Like healthcare just doesn't emerge out of the ether. Someone actually has to provide it. Someone has to pay for it.
Exactly.
So if you have the right to healthcare, then who is obligated to pay for that? Who is obligated to provide it? Who is the slave here, right? And is that a violation of rights?
I would never
the right
say
to bodily, right?
Yeah, and I would never say that the right to healthcare is a universal human right.
Right.
I think healthcare is a privilege.
Sure.
It's a service that's provided within an advanced civilization, but I don't believe that healthcare is a right. And we've been told that there's lots of things that are a right, and they've become a social right if you put that in parenthesis. But I don't believe that healthcare is a natural right any more than education is.
Right. Well, my kind of, I guess, intellectual, I don't know what you say, influence, Murray Rothbard would say that all human rights are property rights, essentially. So I have basically a property right in my body, myself, and the things that I appropriate from nature or freely trade for, those things are mine. And he, so even free speech, for example, is simply a property right. In other words, you can't touch me or my property for the words I'm saying. On the other hand, that same right allows me, if you say words I don't like at my kitchen table about my wife on her birthday, I can kick your ass out.
Absolutely.
You're trespassing, right? So that's that same property right that lets me kick you out of my house for the words that come out of your mouth. Allow me to say whatever I want in the public square or on my own property. So that's kind of how Murray Rothbard, so to me, that's the simplest way to think about rights.
I like that for sure. So, if you want to circle back to one of your previous questions in terms of kind of the declaration, its ultimate purpose is to, on the personal side, again, if you go to the declarative statements, I wanted to give people an opportunity to go, hey, I can take these declarative statements and I can draw a line in the sand for myself.
Right.
Because I can say, I am not going to comply. There's power in saying those words or reading those words from a personal perspective. If you believe that you don't want to comply, and it's not a coercive document, but for people that it resonates with, you know what? I'm not going to comply with any regulation, mandate, directive. If I feel it's going to violate my my inalienable rights as a Canadian and a human being. So that's kind of that part of it. And politically, on the bigger scope, it's about a dream to create a completely new constitution for Canada, a constitution that's drafted outside of the realm of political parties and government.
Right, by the
to
people,
create-
almost, eh?
by the people, and we've actually started that process. We've actually got a draft preamble
Oh, nice.
to a constitution, and we're working on the Declaration of Rights,
Right.
which will form the next portion.
And by the way, audience, if you want to read this declaration, the link to it is in the show notes down below, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, that link is down there. So feel free to pop that up. Like Brenton said, it's about 1,300 words. Why don't we actually, Brenton, why don't we get you to read that document and let's talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, we can.
Pull it up here.
If you'd like me to read it, for sure.
Well, let me ask you this. How long do you think it would take to read it? 1,300 words?
It'll take about I don't know, 7-8 minutes, something like that.
Okay, well let's do it. That's not too long. I think my audience has that attention span. We can do it, guys, right?
Yeah.
This is for the future of Canada. Here's what I love, Brenton. Like, I've been a liberty activist to like leader of the Libertarian Party. This is super important to me. I cashed in my pension even to run as leader of the Libertarian Party. I knew I wasn't going to get many votes. I wanted to get the message out there, right? I'm banging my head against the wall, looking for people to shake their fist at government and like hold the line and stand up to the totalitarianism that I have seen going on for my whole life, right? I mean, income tax, what's that? Central banks, come on, all these regulations. I can't have lawn darts. I can't have a baby walker. I mean, all these things make me absolutely nuts. But I'm not going to start a revolution by myself. I'm not going to, lead the charge. So what I love is that Justin Trudeau has actually made more libertarians in the past 2 years than I could have ever hoped to make as a liberty activist for the last 10. It actually makes me kind of jealous.
That is so true.
But and this is another thing that's emerged from it. And this is what's got me so excited. So go ahead and if you wouldn't mind reading that, I'll pop it up on the screen here for you guys to read along with as well.
Sure. So it's called the True North Declaration, March 15th, 2023. This is the unanimous declaration of the True North, Canada's freedom nation. Recent events in our nation's history have confirmed to citizens from coast to coast to coast that Canada is broken. Since Confederation, most Canadians believed that government respected our God-given rights and freedoms, and that the tyranny which reigned in faraway places would never find its way to our shores. But if we are truthful in recollecting our history, over the past 30 years, there have been many signs and many warnings. A little loss of freedom here and a little less of liberty there, and all the while the True North being bullied and coddled into the cage of a totalitarian state in the making. The Freedom Convoy was the last canary in the coal mine. The thousands who joined in Ottawa asking our Prime Minister to lift mandates that abridged their rights and freedoms were no fringe minority. They were instead true patriots, representing millions of Canadians who'd been witnessing the True North strong and free being toppled like a statue and replaced with a pillar of tyranny and despotism. For generations, it was simply assumed that our rights and freedoms were protected in our Constitution. But sadly, this assumption was mistaken, since in fact Canadians have been subject to a great charade. This charade masked the truth that government considers our natural rights and liberties not inalienable, but merely privileges granted by Parliament under the Crown that can readily be withdrawn at the whim of government. Indeed, our Bill of Rights from 1960 recognized many liberties, but could be amended or repealed by Parliament at any time, proving that the rights purportedly recognized in the bill were in fact privileges and not rights at all. This truth was confirmed when Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act in 1970 and suspended the rights and freedoms of Canadians. While our Bill of Rights had a brief pretense of liberty, it birthed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms entrenched in our Constitution Act of 1982 to safeguard our liberties from the whims of Parliament. The charade of Canadian liberty ended when the Freedom Convoy 2022 was bludgeoned by Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act. His use of violence to crush the Freedom Convoy proved yet again that Parliament is sovereign and that, as with our Bill of Rights, the Charter is simply political sleight of hand. While the Charter proclaims our rights and freedoms, Sections 1 and 33 guarantee the supremacy of Parliament to limit those freedoms as government determines, confirming that the Charter is about privileges, not rights. And thus, the fundamental flaw in our Constitution lies exposed. Drafted by Great Britain to ensure Parliament's sovereignty over Canadians and to serve the interests of the British Empire, it contains no recognition to the inalienable rights of Canadians. Rather, a cursory look to the past proves that for generations, government has used the Constitution to abuse Canadians. The Indian Act, the internment of Ukrainian Canadians during World War I, the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, forced sterilizations, the MK Ultra experiments, the Crow's Nest freight rates, the National Energy Program, ideologically driven gun control, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's campaign to destroy the natural resource economies of Western Canada. Recent examples of continued abuses by government against the people of Canada include closing our economies, prohibiting us from tending to loved ones who are sick or dying, suspending the order of Parliament, segregating us with vaccine mandates and passports, restricting our travel within Canada, coercing us into taking experimental vaccines against our will, firing and fining us for refusing to comply with COVID mandates, refusing to acknowledge adverse vaccine effects and injury, censoring free speech regarding vaccines, COVID treatment, and policy, punishment of healthcare professionals for voicing concerns regarding vaccine side effects and treatment options, invoking the Emergencies Act to crush illegal protest with violence, taking political prisoners such as Pastor Artur Pawlowski, Tamara Leach, and Pat King, and the boys from Coots, freezing bank accounts of Canadians because they supported the Freedom Convoy, stripping our rights to freely own and use arms, censoring free speech, the internet, and criminalizing communication, making lawful medically assisted suicide rather than supporting people in need, undermining our national sovereignty by supporting illegal immigration and the globalist agendas of the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization, tacitly supporting the efforts and ambitions of the Communist Party of China, creating massive debt, high inflation, and high interest rates, destroying our natural resource and agricultural economies, imposing massive carbon taxes, pursuing total control over our lives, including what we drive, what we eat, what jobs we will have, and how we will adapt in their future imagined green economy. Imposition of a digital currency and digital ID to exert complete control over the social, economic, and political lives of all Canadians. It is abundantly clear that our Constitution does not recognize our inalienable rights. What instead Canadians suffer is the tyranny of Parliament that has the supremacy to suspend those rights, to appoint judges biased in support of Parliament's discretion over Charter's rights and freedoms, and enable federal usurpation of provincial jurisdictions, continue to repress First Nations under the Indian Act, and impose all Canadians to the lies, deceptions, and corruptions of politicians and their supporting cast of bureaucrats. As such, we Canadians vow to exercise our natural duty and moral obligation to choose the path taken by millions of patriots before us who stood for freedom in the face of tyranny. From Boadicea fighting to free her people from Roman rule over Britannia in 60 AD, the rebel barons who forced King John of England to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215, our honored soldiers storming Juno Beach, Normandy in June 1944, the small protests against the violation of our rights with mask and vaccine mandates that began in our streets in 2020, to the Freedom Convoy 2022 that sought redress in our nation's capital. Therefore, whereas all people are created equally with naturally endowed, inalienable rights and liberties, and whereas the natural authority for the creation and legitimate operation of civil government are derived from the people, and whereas we believe that the fundamental objective of government is to preserve and enlarge the freedom of Canadians through the vigorous defense and protection of our naturally endowed rights, and whereas we believe that provinces and territories must have distinct and independent constitutions guaranteeing their greatest sovereignty within a confederation, and whereas we desire a constitution that will unite all Canadians in a commonwealth of freedom, equality, and purpose that reserves sovereignty to the Canadian people, where all levels of government are constrained by established limits, clearly defined separation of powers, and separate representation for the peoples and regions of the nation. Therefore, we declare, we are the true North, Canada's freedom nation, and we will not surrender Canada to the political elites and their post-nationalist agenda. We believe all people are created equally in the image of God with inalienable rights and liberties, including the right to life, liberty, and personal property. We believe in the power of loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. We will not surrender our God-given rights to any government and would rather die as free people standing bravely in the face of tyranny than live as serfs beholden to a dictator such as Justin Trudeau. We will hold the line and not comply with any law, order, regulation, mandate, or directive from government that infringes on our inalienable rights and liberties. We will freely exercise our inalienable rights and freedoms, including the right to free speech, the right to self-defense, the right to privacy, the right to practice our faith, the right to freely associate, and the right to personal property. We possess the right of self-determination, and from this strength we will organize a Congress of Canadians from coast to coast to coast to frame a new constitution for the nation under which sovereign provinces can unite in a federation that will guarantee the rights and liberties of the true North strong and free to prosper and to endure with the grace and blessings of God.
Beautiful. Love it. Well, thank you so much for writing that. And, I'm hoping that this will inspire some people and eventually lead to, a chat about the Constitution. Now, once we get a constitution, our work is still ahead of us. The U.S. in many ways had one of the best constitutions ever written. It's now one of the biggest, most pervasive imperialist governments the world has ever seen. Mm-hmm. So, constitution alone might not be enough to chain government down. It seems like government always finds a way to escape those chains. What do you think is the key to keeping a liberty?
Well, I think you raise an incredibly sobering point, and it's one that I wrestle with a lot. I think that the framers of the U.S. Constitution, they said it well in their preamble that they were pursuing to create a more perfect union, and the folks who wrote the U.S. Constitution. I mean, there was a pretty small group of people that were involved. Most of the Constitution was actually drafted by James Madison, I believe. But all of them were, all the key players were well educated in British law and the system of British Parliament, because that's where they'd been trained. I mean, the American colonies were British colonies. And they knew everything. They knew the ins and outs of British Parliament and parliamentary procedure, just like we do here in Canada. And they took everything that they didn't like and that was not working, and they tried to make something that was the best that they could to address the problems that they saw. And you see this, in their Bill of Rights, which we talk about as their amendments to their Constitution primarily have been the Bill of Rights. But throughout that, and I think in our process, there's some, great templates like, I've been reading again a whole pile of U.S. state constitutions, which if you take the Constitution of Massachusetts, for example, which John Adams wrote, that was the first constitution of its kind ratified in the world. It's the oldest continuously used written constitution on earth, 1780. So that was put in place 8 years before the American Constitution that we currently have was ratified. But I think to your question, I think like any problem that you're going to solve, you identify the things that you need to address and then create a mechanism to solve it or prevent it. So there's a lot of things that I don't think the founding fathers, the people that signed off on the U.S. Constitution, there's lots of things that they never saw coming.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think,
I think one of the things, that they maybe never saw coming is how kind of lackadaisical culture gets, right? I mean, that old meme of hard men create good times create soft men, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. It's true. I'd like to think we could get off that repeating treadmill, because if I'm a hard man, why do I want to create good times anymore? It's just going to create soft men who are going to make things shitty. But
that's true.
But for a while I thought, because if you I think of that Lysander Spooner quote about the U.S. Constitution. I can't remember when I don't know, it was in the 1800s or early 1900s, but he basically said either the Constitution has authorized this kind of tyranny, or it has been powerless to stop it. Either way, it's basically as good as toilet paper. I'm butchering his quote, but it was something like that. And so I thought, well, maybe the second half of that, I mean, you have to have that Constitution kind of restraining it or articulating that restraint, but then you also have to have a strong will from the people. And that requires an engaged kind of population that is not letting government get away with it, is holding it to the Constitution. But instead, what seems to happen whenever you have a government form is people look for freebies. They look for free riders. They look to outsource their personal responsibility in any way they can to the government. And they do it in the name of, we need to save lives, or we need to prevent death, or there's a pandemic coming, or, you could think of 1,000 different emergencies or excuses that are legitimate sounding, let's say. And I mean, it takes an incredible amount of self-knowledge and perception to ward against those things as a population.
Yeah. Well, I think you touch on, I think it's the Achilles heels. The Achilles heel in everything seems to be, who manages the public purse. Right. And governments, I mean, it didn't take very long. As soon as, like, the United States actually is on its second constitution. They had a constitution after they won the war with Britain, and they had a peace settlement. But it was found to not be everything that everyone wanted it to be in terms of commerce and trade. And there was some federalist kind of things. And so if you read the Federalist Papers that were written prior to the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, that was an effort by a number of writers to convince people that this new Constitution was going to be a better thing for America. And I think in looking at it, I mean, it certainly has been. It's produced probably arguably the greatest economic nation on earth, although I think that's in decline as we're seeing now. But I think that the lesson that I've taken away from it is that in the division of powers in government, somehow there needs to be another layer that is another division. And I haven't quite been able to wrap my head around it, but the other division, I believe, needs to be around money. The people that are, if you have and our country's no different, when politicians have the public purse, they want to throw money around to get reelected.
Right.
They buy votes, and we've created this culture of, we're going to create a social program, and now it's your right to have that, and now we got to feed you more of it, and it's a never-ending thing.
Right.
And somehow there needs to be another limit on government when it comes to spending money. And I think that's a great conversation for us to engage in.
Yeah. Like, is it abolishing the central bank? Is it going to a free market of banks? Is it,
Yeah.
yeah. What exactly is it?
But
You,
you
you
can't
know,
have everyone in. You can't have all the politicians just shelling out everyone else's
right.
shelling out money, because that is a direct violation of everyone's right to personal property.
Yes.
Because
Well, they're robbing your buying power by
they just pillage
turning
it.
on the printing press, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever read the speech that Davy Crockett gave to the Congress? It's before he went to the Alamo where he died.
No.
It's called "It's Not Yours to Give."
Huh.
And
Okay.
he gave this speech in Congress in response to a bill that was put into Congress where the people in Congress wanted to, and I don't know which party it was, but there was a bill on the floor to take public money and pay for all the damage that had been done to a large fire that had ripped through Georgetown. And so they
Hmm.
wanted to take public money and
Right.
pay for all the damage that had been done to all these people's houses. And it's unfortunate, they were, people's homes that burned down, and they were
Yeah.
stepping in and going, you know what, we need to do something. And
But they're going to use taxpayer funds to,
he argued that, you know what, it's not your money to give.
right.
And if you want to donate to that cause, then write a check yourself, because
Interesting.
you're taking money from the farmer, in some other part of the country that, he's having just as much hardship, and other
Yeah. Yeah.
people are having trouble, and you just
Yeah.
can't pick and choose and take other people's money like that. And he
Yeah.
gave a very compelling argument, and I've given copies of it to a number of elected officials, and
Wow.
I don't think it's
I'm
been
gonna
well
have to.
received.
I'm gonna have to pull that up, because actually
Yeah.
one of my kind of side projects. I'm a firefighter by trade, and so one of my dreams, that I've slowly been working out over the years is building up. I want to write a book about how firefighting can be done outside the state, let's say, and how historically it was, and in fact, the London fires, the Great Fire of London, the conflagration that happened there. Up until that point, it had been primarily done by insurance companies trying to do it. But that giant conflagration was obviously very expensive for insurance companies, and they wanted to basically outsource their responsibility to government again. And you see how government and big government kind of grows, right? It's like, okay, we don't want to be responsible for our failures at preventing and extinguishing these fires. We want to outsource that to the city of London and to the taxpayers. You guys should run the fire brigade and have that as your like city thing. And so, again, what I would argue is that fire services should probably be managed or run by something like an insurance company who actually has an incentive to make sure fires never happen and make sure they're effectively put out when they do happen. But they've been outsourced to the state. And so that's another thing I could put in there, that Davy Crockett,
It's a good point.
because that's exactly, again, the same type of idea
Yeah.
in there. One of the things, and I'll get your thought on it, like I should probably wrap up here pretty quick. We've been going almost an hour, but I often think, I remember my daughter getting in trouble in Catholic school. I can't remember why, but she was pointing out how she's worried that, 200 years in the future, people are going to be laughing at her beliefs the same way her class was laughing at the Aztecs in their harvest, cutting human hearts out and doing human sacrifice. I sometimes think about that. And I wonder, okay, 200 years from now, like 200 years ago, we thought, most of the world thought slavery was perfectly fine. There was no moral progress, let's say. There was just the natural order of things, kind of like how we see the state right now. And I'm wondering if 200 years in the future, I often kind of fantasize what it'll be that people 200 years from now look back on at this time and think, well, that was just like, what were they, barbarians? What were they thinking? And sometimes I think, well, maybe it's government itself that is the barbaric enterprise. I mean, here it is, a monopoly on violence. It has a mandate to use violence. All these governments come into existence primarily through conquest and plunder. Like, I don't know, I can't think of too many that have emerged peacefully from just some sort of self-governing agreement among the people. It's usually a group of elite that rile up, conquest and plunder. But some things that give me hope, or maybe it's a technological solution, So for example, I know some fellas that are doing this thing called seasteading. Patrick Friedman, he's actually Milton Friedman's grandson. And he's got this organization called the Seasteading Organization. They're trying to build offshore platforms. The idea is you create this floating city that does whatever, mines seaweed, or, you know, there's all sorts of, or does offshore medical research away from, you know, regulation and different things like that.
Drill for oil.
There you go, whatever. But they do, but then you have a bunch of other seasteaders pulling up and docking and kind of forming a community, right? And the originator of that community kind of sets the rules, and you are agreeing explicitly to those rules. There's essentially a contract that would occur where you're agreeing to rules. You maybe agree to pay an annual fee for upkeep of infrastructure that holds the community together or whatever. And there's immediate access to justice if a contract is breached one way or the other, either by the resident or the so-called government. That's not, but you know, and there's also some people I know that are experimenting with private cities, you know. So again, there's an explicit contract with the city owner who owns the streets, the infrastructure, the parks, sometimes the fire department. There's certain guarantees that are made, like your garbage is going to be picked up, your potholes are going to be filled. And the guarantee on the other side is you'll abide by architectural controls, and you'll pay your annual fees. They don't call them taxes because they're not coercive, because you're voluntarily agreeing to them. But there's an explicit contract. It's not this kind of airy-fairy social contract that we're all told about, that we all signed on to by virtue of being spit out of our mother's birth canals in a particular geography. It's an actual explicit contract. And I sometimes wonder if that's the way to go, or eventually. I mean, if that's going to be the technology that takes us to the next level, where we can actually have enforceable contracts with what we might call a government, or the dispute resolution organization, or the third party that we contract with to underwrite our economic and relational transactions in a society. You know, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about what I've said? Does it all sound like complete utter nonsense to you? Or?
You know what? Hey, I don't think any of it sounds like nonsense, because I think that, you know, the thing that I love about this conversation is that I've met someone that's, you know, thinking about things that are, you know, topics and problems that most people don't think are solvable.
Right.
And we need more people that can believe that you can land a man on the moon.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, so, you know, I think, I don't think those things are crazy. I think we need to come up with all sorts of potential solutions and debate them.
Yeah.
And you know, I think, and have the best ideas win. You know, my personal foundational piece is, you know, to be in a, I hope that, you know, one day Canadians can live in a country, maybe it's not even called Canada, but that people in Canada can live in a country where the people of the country are sovereign over Parliament, or the Republic, whatever form of government is chosen. But I believe that the people need to be sovereign. People need to be sovereign over everything ultimately, and that includes even the Supreme Courts that you put in a nation.
Yeah.
I think, you know, when the Supreme Court, you know, makes bad decisions that are not supported by the population of the country, that should be overridden, because the people need to be supreme. And I'd love for Canadians to live in a country where their natural rights, that everyone can agree to, or most people can agree, hey, you know what, here's a set of natural rights that seem reasonable, and that they are inviolable, they're inalienable, and that our agreement to come together to have government to protect and enlarge those freedoms. I think it's a dream, and I think that it's a dream worth having. It's a discussion that is anathema to government, anathema to the legal profession, and it's not going to be well accepted or encouraged by anyone in political power on a federal level. there are some provincial political parties that are very interested in this. The Buffalo Party of Saskatchewan being one of them.
Right.
They recently actually adopted it formally at their convention as part of their party policy. There's a couple of other provincial parties that are interested in doing the same kind of a thing, and so we're going to be working with them. We're going to be working with to help draft an actual constitution for the province of Saskatchewan, so that the residents there can see what that might look like for them.
Awesome.
Obviously, it doesn't mean anything because it's not part of our legal system. But for people who have never seen an electric car before, here's an electric car, and
Right.
for people that have never seen what a provincial constitution might look like and what the implications of that be, here it is.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, and you know what you've done here, just to kind of close things out, is you've provided a vision, a picture, some inspiration for people to glom onto. You know, all the work you put into this declaration, I thank you very much for doing it, because it gives us a piece to reflect on, to promote, to rally around, that says, yes, this is the thing that has been in my heart and in my brain that I've been trying to say, that I haven't had the words. And Brenton here has put it into words. He spent the time, and he's done exactly what I do. So Brenton, thank you so much for doing what you've done. And I love what you said about, you know, no one believed, you know, until one person believed we could land on the moon, it wasn't possible. Well, people are starting to believe. People are starting to believe, and it's thanks to the work of people like you. So thank you very much for all the work you put into it, and thanks for joining us here on the Tim Moen Show tonight.
Thank you, Tim, for having me, and I really appreciate it, and look forward to a future conversation.
Absolutely. Audience, make sure you subscribe on my locals page. Go to my Substack, Tim Moen. All the links are in the show notes. Appreciate any support you can give me to keep this conversation going, to keep this show on the road, to bring you more important guests like Brenton here. So thank you very much.